Welcome everybody. We're going to take a fascinating trip through the realms of form criticism in this video. We're going to look at how Islam shaped its sources. We'll look at the tradition that's attributed to Abu Huraira, or a group of traditions really that are attributed to him in the Hadith collections about Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, Ishmael, that whole story. We're going to look at the pre-Islamic form of it and then the post-Islamic form of it. We're going to see what Islam had to add or change to this tradition in order to make it acceptable to its own ideology. Now let's start with just a very quick review. Of course, Jews are attested in Arabia as early as the 1st century, and Christians escaped to Arabia as well. Both Jews and Christians in part would come to Arabia to escape Roman persecution, for example. And so by the time we get to the 6th century, we have much evidence attesting to the presence of Jews and Christians in Arabia. I have some sources up on the screen if you'd like to look at the topic of Arabia prior to the Islamic period. Now, Jewish and Christian settlements were scattered around Arabia, and we know from pre-Islamic Arab poets that there were even some of these communities scattered along caravan routes, even into Central Arabia. Now, these communities were, for all intents and purposes, culturally and ethnically Arab. Reuven Firestone concludes the common assumption that all pre-Islamic Arabs were pagan prior to the lifetime of Muhammad is simply erroneous. Now, when the diverse people groups of pre-Islamic Arabia would get together and trade, they would swap stories as well as goods. They would even have annual trading fairs where they would all get together and, of course, trade merchandise as well as, no doubt, compare oral tradition and compare worldviews among their contemporaries. But all of this changed with the arrival of Islam. One result of the great changes brought about by Islamic domination of the Arabian Peninsula was that the once colorful fabric representing the diverse religio-cultural expressions of the 6th and 7th century Arabia survived only as disjointed remnants. Some pre-Islamic legends survived through reinterpretation according to the developing religious standards of early Islam, but more often, certain bits and pieces of ancient tales survived as they were reworked into the legends, evolving to serve as foundations for the newly developing religious system. One such source containing material bearing strong similarities to Biblicist and indigenous pre-Islamic tradition is the revelation known as the Quran. Now, it's interesting to note that the early Muslims actually looked to this material in order to help understand the Quran. They looked at this pre-Islamic tradition, whether it's Christian, Jewish, or otherwise. And the reason that they needed this supporting information to understand the Quran, well, that's quite apparent. One reason I'll mention is not the topic of this video, but it's interesting to note, and that is that apparently Muhammad was crossing lines of literary genres with the Quran. And so the poets would use a poetic diction which was different from vernacular Arabic. And Muhammad's contemporaries weren't expecting the use of this poetic diction in the Quran, and so that's why they accuse him of being either a poet or a mad poet. So perhaps these criticisms of Muhammad's contemporaries make a bit more sense now. They were not expecting this type of genre, of literary genre, in the Quran, and so this caused a lot of confusion, and it was confusing. How do we interpret this? How do we exegete this stuff? And so they turned to external sources. Now, the other reason can be exemplified with Surah 38. In a previous video, we talked about a couple of verses from this surah. We have Solomon and the subjecting of the wind, and the builders and the divers, and bound in shackles and devils. So what's going on here? Well, the Quran assumes that you're familiar with Solomonic literature, and if you are, you can follow the story. If not, well, you're really not going to know what the Quran is talking about, as it just gives you bits and pieces of information in hopes that you can fill in the blanks. And early Muslims would fill in the blanks with Jewish and Christian tradition. They would use this to inform their understanding. But as Islam spread over a more diverse area, standardization was needed. An Islamic framework needed to be set into place and maintained. And so Jewish and Christian tradition fell out of favor, and what arose to take its place were, of course, the Hadith collections and the Sirah and the Tafsir, based on all of these. And so Islamic scholars became concerned about the effects that these lingering extra-Islamic traditions were having on Islamic exegesis. And so they wanted to remove them. But in some cases, it was too late. Some material deriving from Biblicist and pre-Islamic pagan environments had become so well integrated into Islamic lore that they were included in the most respected collections and cited freely in authoritative exegesis of the Quran. Now, Islamic scholars even coined a term for these traditions. They call them Israeliyat. This would be literally translated of Jewish origin, referred to as Israelite tales. And so when Islamic scholars would run across these stories or remnants of these stories still lingering in Islamic tradition, they would call them Israelite tales, and they would dismiss them not on the basis of their historical credibility or lack thereof, but simply on the basis of their content. In fact, however, stories or legends that are specifically designated by medieval Muslim scholars as Israelite tales cannot be found in Jewish literature, at least not as they are found in Islamic sources. A story deemed by Islam as an Israelite tale is actually a unique and authentically Islamic tale. So what we're going to do now is look at one of these tales. We're going to look at the core elements of this narration. Again, these are narrations attributed to Abu Huraira. We're going to look at the core pre-Islamic traditions and then see what Islam did after the fact to make this tale one of its own. So you can see the elements on your screen, just a rough outline of the story with Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. I have some Jewish sources down here with asterisks. These are elements of the story that are traced back to Jewish sources. But you can see, if you wanted to pause the screen and read through it, the narrative can be constructed from Christian and Jewish sources. It's really not that difficult to see where it comes from. You'll see that I have missing here 1, 3, and 12. These are the Islamized elements. Okay, so this is the pre-Islamic form. Now I'm going to show you the Islamized version. All I've done is fill in the blanks with 1, 3, and 12. We're going to talk about these elements. Abraham told only 3 lies. Abraham speaks with Sarah, tells her not to contradict him. And then down here, Abu Huraira adds a closing statement, something like, this is your mother, O people of the water of heaven, or something similar. So what we're going to do now, we've seen the form, the Jewish and Christian form, or the combined form from those two sets of traditions. And then we've looked at the Islamized version. We've seen 3 elements that Islam added. Okay, now let's isolate those. All right, now we have them together on your screen, elements 1, 3, and 12. Now let's look at these 3 elements and see specifically why they're added and why they help and how they help shape this narrative to something that's acceptable within Islamic ideology. Element number 1, Abraham told only 3 lies. Now this goes back to, you hear Muslims today calling Muhammad the holy prophet, and they refuse to believe that he committed any sin. This is the doctrine of the infallibility of the prophets, and this arose very early in Islam. In some sects of Islam, it was on the rise even back in the 8th century. And so for a prophet to commit some sort of a sin, this is just unacceptable in Islamic exegesis from a very long time ago. So this has a lot of momentum, which is why you find Muslims resisting the fact that Muhammad was not actually infallible. But this is not a problem. That may surprise you. Abraham told only 3 lies, and it's not a problem, it hasn't been a problem historically in Islamic exegesis because Abraham was lying for God. So there's no theological issue here. However, this element that has been added to this tradition does something very important. You see, I have Surah 37:89 and 21:63. These are different verses in the Quran that talk about Abraham's other 2 lies. Okay, so do you see what this has done here? In saying Abraham told only 3 lies, and one of them is in the context of this story with Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael, etc. In saying that Abraham told 3 lies, this tradition that goes to Abu Huraira allegedly links this element with the Quran. You see that? So you have this common theme of Abraham lying in this story with Sarah and Hagar, linked to Abraham lying in the Quran. So there's a conceptual parallel. And once again, it's not a problem with the doctrine of the infallibility of the prophets because Abraham was lying for God. So contrary to what you might think, inserting this element about Abraham lying actually serves a very important theological purpose for Muslims, and that is to connect Abraham to the Quran and connect this whole tradition to the Quran. Now, element number 3 is different. Abraham speaks with Sarah and tells her not to contradict him because she is his sister to God. 2, they are the only Muslims on earth, or both 1 and 2. So you can see that this element that's inserted into this tradition attributed to Abu Hurairah serves a very, very important purpose, and that is to uphold the character of Abraham. He didn't really marry his half-sister in Islamic exegesis. She was his sister to God, or they were the only Muslims on earth. Now, this last element, Abu Hurairah used to say, "This is your mother, O people of the water of heaven." This varies a bit. I have a couple of citations if you'd like to look at that. But what this final element by Abu Hurairah does, of course, is very obvious. It connects the genealogy, right? Hagar is the mother of the Arabs, and so now we have the genealogy established from Muhammad back to Hagar and back to Abraham. Now, this did not exist in pre-Islamic times, this genealogical connection. The evidence can be found in Arabic genealogies which appear to connect the northern Arabs and the tribe of Muhammad to Hagar and Ishmael only in late, that is, Islamic texts. Pre-Islamic pagan Arab genealogies appear to have no awareness or concern for the connection. Not only is this genealogical connection something that's not attested to in pre-Islamic Arabia, it was developed in very vivid ways. It was said the king had a daughter of extreme goodness and beauty. I have Genesis 12:11 referenced here because this is where Sarah is described as being very beautiful. And likewise, of course, Muslims can't have Sarah looking better than Hagar, so Hagar is described as being beautiful as well. And she's the daughter of the king, right? And Gabriel came to Abraham and gave him the good news that God would provide him with a child through Hagar, a son through whom would appear a prophet by the name of Muhammad, the seal of the prophets. Now, catch this vivid description. When Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, his face shone like the moon with the light of our prophet Muhammad. So these Islamic elements that were later added serve 3 very important functions. The first is to connect them to the Quran. The second is to connect Muhammad genealogically back to Ishmael, Hagar, and of course eventually Abraham. And the third is to clean up the issue of Abraham's marriage to his half-sister, which offended Islamic sensibilities because of their doctrine of the infallibility of the prophets. Now at this point, Reuven Firestone raises an interesting question. Why is this clearly foreign legend found in important religious and historical works of Islam, particularly in light of the fact that its story is not specifically mentioned or even directly alluded to in the Quran? Now, Firestone then goes on to posit 2 reasons for this. Once the genealogical connection with Hagar was established in the Islamic period, the Abu Hurairah version became an authoritative vehicle for establishing the origin of the matriarch of the northern Arabs. Further, the second reason is that the story was simply a good source for much-needed information about Abraham, the first Muslim. It became a natural exegetical narrative as a midrash, filling the gaps within Quranic references to Abraham's immigration and subsequent adventures. So let's do a quick review of what we've covered so far. Jews and Christians in pre-Islamic Arabia, of course, we talked about that, and the diversity in pre-Islamic Arabia. We talked about how early Muslims benefited from this diversity and that they would use some of these traditions to help inform their understanding of the Quran. And this Jewish and Christian tradition was initially welcomed, but later rejected. Some of these traditions survived, revised in Islamic ideology. We did a case study of the Islamized narrative elements with the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar is attributed to Abu Hurairah, and we talked about why, possibly, Abu Hurairah's tradition became dominant. I hope this video has helped you see how Islam shaped its sources. They would simply take pre-existing traditions and adapt to them, change them, add to them, subtract from them freely in order to suit their own agenda. They didn't seem to have any regard whatsoever for historicity while they were doing this. They would pick and choose and change what they didn't like. For those of you who engage in critical discussion with modern Muslims, you know that well over 1,000 years later, not much has changed with this methodology or lack thereof. As they say, plus ça change, plus elle même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Thanks for watching.